All right, let's bring in Steve Chaggaris and Franco Ordoñez in Washington. Steve is the political director for CBS News, and Franco is a White House correspondent for McClatchy, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Franco, let me start with you. Is President Trump, you think, moving away from his claims that climate change is a hoax? And if so, what would be the significance of that politically?
I think that would be very significant if he were to move away from that, but I don't feel like he's moving away from that yet. We reporters in the White House, we were part of that briefing after the meeting. Yes, Trump is saying that that the environment is important to us, but when we pressed senior administration officials about whether President Trump still feels this is a hoax, that it's a man-made problem, we couldn't get a straight answer, and we definitely pushed pretty hard.
Yeah, so Steve, they didn't get a straight answer, and we heard Gary Cohn there. He didn't say, yes, the president still believes it's a hoax.
Right, but I mean, would we be surprised if he changed his mind on this? I mean, there were many things that he said on the campaign trail, very stark views of issues that he's changed since he's become president. This is a guy who's shown over the course of his life in public life in terms of politics, he's morphed on a lot of different things. So for him to say something's a hoax during the campaign, if he changed his mind tomorrow, I'm not sure I'd be surprised by that. But again, it's interesting to me that we point back to things that Trump has said at one point and then say, well, now you don't mean that. Why are we surprised by that? This is a guy who really, in a lot of different examples, has not held to the very stark positions that he had at one point. It's another point. We point back to tweets that he's had a few years ago on you name the subject, and then we say, well, you said this in 2013, and now you're saying this in 2017. We shouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden Donald Trump in the next month or so decides that climate change isn't a hoax.
Well, Franco, Steve brings up a really good point, but I guess the bottom line here, though, is because there has been disagreement on the basic facts regarding climate change, that then would set the terms. If there is indeed an evolution in the president's thinking on climate change, that would seem to set the terms for the political debate of how to handle that.
It's true. I mean, I think there is a lot of debate there. President Trump is, he has spoken more. You mentioned Gary Cohn, his comments. Gary Cohn also spoke about how Trump, after meeting with world leaders at the G7 about his thinking on climate control, that he had learned some things about this issue. He says now that it's an important issue. He won't say it's a hoax. He won't. But what I find interesting is that he still won't say that, but at the same time, I feel like he is reverting back to kind of campaign speak over the last few weeks, including in Europe, that a certain tenor that we hadn't heard before, which I also feel like also kind of shows a little bit of emergence of Steve Bannon in today's discussion.
And on that point, Steve, President Trump's campaign sent an email to supporters touting the decision as a quote-unquote promise kept, something he said in the Rose Garden as well. What are the implications of framing this decision in terms of a campaign pledge?
Well, it's interesting. Franco makes a very good point about him sounding like sounding these campaign themes. I mean, look, this is a president who, again, his approval numbers are not very high. He's somebody who has a cloud of controversy surrounding him at every turn, and so I think when he's confronted by that controversy and he's confronted by those negatives, he tends to reach back to his base, and his base he spoke to his base today. If you listen to the things that he said in that speech, saying things like America first, and this is a massive redistribution of U.S. wealth to other countries, and we got to stop doing that. These are things that he said over and over again on the campaign trail. These are things that his supporters loved him for. And so again, this is sort of getting that foundation set again in terms of his support and moving forward. Now the question is, politically, what does this mean for him? Again, we've seen at every turn as president that he's been able to keep his base behind him, but he hasn't been able to bring other people into the tent. And so moving forward on the environmental issues, is this going to be a political liability for him and Republicans moving forward? We don't know the answer to that. Environmental issues have never really been at the top of the list of voters' minds when it comes to voting in elections. But But we'll see. Do Democrats make this part of campaign ads going into the midterms next year? Does this become a big issue for him as he runs for re-election in 2020? We'll see. As Franco said, this is him sort of going back to the base and speaking about those issues that really rally his supporters. And right now, anything positive is going to be, in his mind, that's good for him.
And Franco, on one side of this debate, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, who supported the accord. On the other, Scott Pruitt and Steve Bannon. What, if anything, did we learn, Franco, about the president's decision-making process?
I mean, I find it really fascinating. I see two things, kind of what, just speaking before. One is that speaking to the base. One is going back to the campaign speak. Two is kind of like a little bit of a change in the foreign policy speak again. Over the last few months, you know, Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump had kind of emerged playing a much larger role in this White House. Steve Bannon, while he had played a much larger role during the campaign or at the end of the campaign, was kind of moved a little bit to, you know, figuratively, kind of a corner of the White House. He wasn't talked about very much. His views were not seen as Jared Kushner and Ivanka kind of took larger roles. Now, in a way that they are kind of a little under more scrutiny. Jared Kushner is obviously kind of ensnarled by a lot of this Russia controversy. You see Steve Bannon kind of emerging back into the forefront on such a prominent issue. It'll be very interesting to see how this kind of continues as Jared Kushner and Ivanka will they continue to take kind of a more quiet role? You know, we're hearing from advisors of this White House that, you know, Ivanka is still very much in part of the administration, one of the most important advisors. Jared Kushner, as you had pointed out earlier, was supposedly involved with the announcement in some ways, but them not being there, that is a significant factor that you know, should not be just kind of, you know, passed away. I mean, that was noticed by many people, and I think it's very significant because after the speech, after the statement, it was Steve Bannon who was kind of getting pats on the back, kind of hugging different guests, and he hasn't been at those kind of Rose Garden ceremonies recently. So to see him there smiling and kind of getting those accolades, I found very interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We haven't seen him in that setting recently. All right, let's pivot to James Comey's upcoming testimony set for June 8th. This line in the New York Times got our attention, quote, "Putting the highly anticipated hearing on the calendar would force Mr. Trump to decide whether to invoke executive privilege and try to prevent Mr. Comey from testifying." To talk more about that, let's bring in CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reed. So, Paula, how could President Trump block Comey from testifying?
Well, Lane, he has a constitutional right to keep certain conversations private. But that right is not absolute. It's not a blanket right. And in fact, there are no precedent that we can see of preventing a former official who wants to testify about a conversation with the president from doing so. So it doesn't seem there's a precedent. And also, he sort of undermined his ability to invoke this right by talking about these conversations. He's, of course, tweeted about conversations he had with a former FBI director, and it's going to be hard to convince a judge ultimately that he wants to invoke this privilege, even though he talked about these conversations. Director Comey cannot.
I'm wondering, Franco, have you heard anything from your sources at the White House about this possibility?
We've not heard directly that that he's considering, you know, evoking this executive privilege. You got to wonder that this is something that the administration is likely thinking about, considering. I mean, this is an administration that weighs its options. It's not afraid to use its powers in this regard. You know, it would be a risky move politically to evoke this privilege. It would only raise more questions about whether this administration has things to hide if it were to do that. At the same time, this administration is not necessarily worried about those kind of things, those perception attitudes. And if they think this is the way to go, you know, I wouldn't be too surprised if they did evoke that privilege. That said, there's a lot of other investigations where this kind of information would likely come out in the FBI investigation, et cetera.
Steve, what do you think? Would it be politically risky?
Absolutely. I think it's totally politically risky, and you know, it's also I think it's less of a risk, frankly, for them to just let him testify. You know, as we've seen with Comey, you know, he's going to hold back in a public setting to a certain extent, and I'm not sure how much he's going to spill in front of Congress. I mean, I know he's not the FBI director anymore, but I would think that if this has been cleared by the special counsel and this has been, you know, sort of an agreement, I think there's probably going to be, you know, limits to what Comey is going to say publicly. We'll probably dump a little bit more information to the special counsel behind closed doors. That's probably where the president has to worry more about what Comey is going to say. Yes, from a political standpoint, it's behind closed doors, so that's delayed. But you know, I'm not sure the worry is as much for him in terms of the public testimony as it would be for what's going to be happening behind closed doors with Bob Mueller.
And Paula, you alluded to this a moment ago, but President Trump, we recall, tweeted an apparent threat, some said, they interpreted it that way, to James Comey, saying he'd, quote, better hope that there are no tapes of our conversations. In what ways, Paula, might President Trump be exposing himself legally through his tweets?
Oh, Elaine, it's a nightmare. It's a criminal defense lawyer's nightmare to have a client who is tweeting about sensitive matters that are known to be under investigation by the FBI and now the special counsel. The president's travel ban, for example, in that case, his own words, the president's campaign statements, were used against him. A large part of the reason that travel ban has been put on hold and kept on hold is because the judges take the policy and look at the statements that he has made and take them, you know, take that as context and have ultimately struck it down based on his own words. Now, those weren't tweets, they were campaign statements, but the same thing applies. If they're going to look at him for obstruction of justice, a tweet like that could certainly be used as evidence or circumstantial evidence, but still, it's not helpful, which is certainly why his legal team continues to discourage him from tweeting.
Steve, let me ask you, Russian President Vladimir Putin moved away from his previous blanket denials and on Thursday suggested that, quote unquote, patriotically minded private Russian hackers may have been involved in cyber attacks to meddle in the election. What role, Steve, would you expect those remarks to play in the U.S. investigations?
Pretty large role. I mean, it's, basically, he's changing his tune and saying, oh, maybe there was some meddling going on. Yeah, he's not saying he's directed that meddling, but the fact that he's saying that, I think, is pretty significant. It's almost a, you know, admitting that that what the investigators in this country have found is accurate, and so I think that's going to be a big part of what happens here. But it also it raises the question to the president and others who still aren't 100% on board with the idea that this Russian meddling was solely Russian, and you know, it's probably worth asking the president and others in the administration what their thoughts of Putin's comments are. I'd be interested to find out what the president thinks about that.
Yeah, have we heard anything, Franco, on that front?
You know, the president, as you know, has been pretty tight-lipped in regards to, you know, communications with the Russian. He's pretty much denied flatly that he has had those kind of communications, and he's playing it even closer to the breast now that Jared Kushner is under such tight scrutiny. I couldn't agree more that this information is extremely important and is going to be looked at very, very closely. I think anything that comes out about you know, this issue is something that is really going to be poked through with a very fine-tooth comb because it has such large significance of so many different investigations that are ongoing.
Absolutely. All right, Steve Chaggaris, Franco Ordoñez, and Paula Reed, thank you all so much.
Thanks, Elaine.
And tune in for a special edition of Red and Blue next Thursday. We'll have extensive post-game coverage of former FBI Director James Comey's testimony before Congress. It all gets started at 7 p.m. Eastern right here on CBSN.